So today we will be covering a little bit deeper look into our study rules. Last week, just kind of the basics we covered with some other topics in our previous webinar. Basically, the real short recap is that we defined study rules as the way to customize the trial validation within ARM. And the session last time was all about trying to use that validation to review trials as quickly and efficiently as possible. Of course, that was kind of an after the fact, as a trial has been performed and we want to review it, but study rules really optimally would be something applied at the beginning of the season in the protocol, and being able to utilize the functionality that comes with those rules in every single trial within that experiment, all the different trials that come from that protocol. And from a sponsor's perspective or the protocol writer's perspective, there's incredible power in having that list available in every trial, and having trialists, as the trial is being performed, run that validation and make sure everything is filled in consistently the way we want. Pieces of information are there that we need, so we don't have to go chase down individuals as we're getting trials back in kind of the busiest time of the year. So a little bit of setup earlier on in the game saves tons and tons of time later on, and that's really the goal. The goal with study rules is saving time and maybe beefing up our consistency and the actual information we've got in our trials. So we really won't spend too much time on that. The really basic study rules of this field is required. I need you to fill in GPS coordinates. I need you to, put in the crop variety, whatever it is. That's all kind of the basics. And we'll look at some of the other functions and features. And some of the rules are practically tools that you can implement within ARM. As opposed to just pointing at certain pieces of information that should get filled in. All right, so kind of our first look is to really run through our top 5 list of study rules. We've just kind of extracted the most impactful, like if you don't have time to click through every single study rule to learn what they do and things like that, these ones are the biggest bang for your buck, if you will, of really unlocking a lot of capabilities, a lot of functionality that'll really help out in trials. So number 5, the first one is, I guess, maybe not a study rule itself, but a component and feature of study rules that was added fairly recently within the last year within ARM. So you may or may not have actually seen this yet in ARM, but it's the ability to define when a study rule that you're creating, when should that rule actually be activated based on really any other field in the trial. So previously, and when we talked about kind of the basics of study rules, typically it's the trial status that is the point, the determiner of what when the rule should be active. And you can say, well, as soon as the trial is established, you should know the GPS coordinates, so we can require them then. However, we definitely wouldn't be ready to require the harvest date, because that doesn't happen till the very end. So maybe we would have the harvest date being required when the trial status is final. So there's this kind of a timeline, all assuming that you're using the trial status field. So we added these conditional, this conditional capability to study rules so that you're not limited to using just trial status. You could find any other field in the trial and have that be what triggers a study rule that you've created. So an example I have on the screen here is I want to require the planting rate for for the crop that's defined in the study, but I only want that planting rate to be defined once the planting has actually occurred. And so I can be more specific instead of just leaning on the trial status and guessing as to, well, when things went out and planted, that's probably this trial status. I can instead queue off of the planting date field. So as soon as the planting date value is filled in for a crop, then the planting rate will pop up as being required to fill in. But obviously, there's no way to fill in the planting rate until it actually occurs and the date has been entered. So it's really this way to customize when something is being triggered. And so you define that conditional from the rule that, I want this planting rate. I'm going to make it conditional. When should it be active? It should be active only on this condition. And I can define, look in the site description, the planting date field. And in this case, I had it set so once the planting date is not a blank, then I know I can require the planting rate. So there's a lot of flexibility that brings us in a lot of excuse me, a lot of different scenarios suddenly where this might be useful for. And I think the biggest impact can be if you're in a group that has a global rule set where you have maybe a short list of rules that really apply to every single study that our company sends out. We have a very basic set, I want GPS coordinates. It doesn't matter what type of study it is. These are super basic things we just have to have. And these conditional rules, I think, can really make that list more powerful because you can turn on or turn off rules in that sense by using a conditional. So only certain types of studies perhaps ever really trigger that rule, whereas those other types that it doesn't apply to, you can still have that rule in the list. You just don't have to have it active based on the contents of that study. So just looking a little deeper, you can make a fairly sophisticated condition if you needed to. So here, kind of looking at the little wizard that helps you set up the condition statement itself. Again, this is when to require a certain information. In my example, I'm looking at the GPS accuracy of my GPS coordinates in the trial. I want to require that when, and I've defined that we want to look at the site and design, the site type, and there's actually maybe 3 different site types from that list that really all would be reasonable ones that I would want that accuracy. So if it's a field study, or if it's an orchard, or if it's a research plot, I can pick multiple by just clicking the plus or. So we're just putting a logical or on the site type to pick more than one value from the site type list that all should be valid, if you will. So this way, any study that is a field study or an orchard study, all of those will require the GPS accuracy. But maybe my greenhouse study, I can still have this rule in my global set, but a greenhouse study just will never trigger this rule. So again, hopefully, if you recall last week with our rule set, where you create a list of rules that you put in every single study, you can kind of see how suddenly we can really make it more dynamic and much smarter. So we can include a lot of rules and just natively have them turn on or off based on the type of study, based on certain conditions that we care about. So that way we don't have to build a bunch of different rule sets for a bunch of different types of studies. We can just have one that is just smart enough to know when to take place and when not to. And then we also have an and. So if I want to look at more than one field in the trial for this condition, now I can pop up and say, also, my trial origin, I want to be equal to C, which I think is contracted out. So I've described that my GPS accuracy, really don't need it unless you're out in the field or an orchard or research plot, and if it's a contracted out study. So we've got our internal list. If it's one of our own studies that we're doing within our company, we know what our coordinates are, so we don't really need it. So you can really build a lot of intelligence in our conditional statements. Kind of touched on these, but just to recap some of the different ideas and things you can do with the conditionals when they might be useful. So the timing, as we said, once an action happens and something is put into ARM, that triggers some other information should get filled in. Another example is harvest. Harvest occurred. Now I know that percent standard moisture can get filled in, or whatever other information can get filled in now that something is there. Or you can kind of at a high level decide whether or not a rule matters based on the type of trial that this is. So maybe we look at the discipline field. Would be a really good high level just categorization of the type of study we're dealing with. If it's a biostimulant study, there's probably a certain set of fields that matter that maybe other trials just don't matter at all. And again, that ties into our global rule set. So new function that really unlocks a lot of doors. If you do have any questions, if you're trying to get the logic to work and you're just not sure how to make it work, definitely let us know, send us an email, and we can kind of help. It can get pretty, if you need to, it can get pretty complicated. We tried to make this interface straightforward enough that you don't accidentally make something that just can't occur, or logically just goes around in a circle or anything like that. But hopefully there's some good value there. All right, so that was number 5. That was a long-winded one. Not all of these will be quite so long. It's a big package to open up. So moving on to number 4, it's another condition. Actually, it's a type, something we can do with a rule. It is the ability to lock a field to prevent edits to that information. It's really once we can select a field that once it's been filled in, it shouldn't change. Probably the most common use would be that as a protocol writer, I'm putting something in that is for us, for our company, and so the trialist should not edit. Like the trial ID in this example is probably the most obvious one, that if this ID gets changed, all of my internal systems are going to break. It's not going to be good. So I'm going to fill in the trial ID, and then I'm going to lock it so that way it cannot be changed. And you can do that for quite a few fields. Not necessarily every single field, but I think there's a good percentage that can be locked if desired. The one tip here that might be the best thing to just as a just in case, and to try to maybe avoid potential issues in the middle of the season, is trying to use the recommended type instead of making it required. And the reason is if you use required for the type, then there is absolutely no way that someone else can change the information. However, if you set this to recommended, then the user, if they were to click into that field and try to change it, there'll be a message that pops up and warns them that it's recommended not to change this. Only change this if you absolutely have to. And the advantage here is if there's some weird, rare situation that comes up that the trialist has to adjust something. Obviously, trial ID is not a good example. I think that one's a slam dunk that could probably always be locked. But some other information in maybe the treatment editor, you thought you could lock down the product list, but then something happened, and in this certain region, we really needed to swap out for another product or whatever. Having it be set to recommended gives the flexibility for the trialist to change it when it's absolutely necessary. And they'll still see this message, so that way they're still warned. They won't just randomly be changing things just because whatever. There'll be kind of the stern warning to them that, hey, you need to be considering whether this really needs to change or not. Because the alternative, if you have locked this down entirely and something happens and it needs to get changed, the only way to change that then is for the trialist to send that trial back to the protocol owner, back to whoever created this study rule, and that person then would need to delete the study rule or make the change themselves in order to actually get that change accomplished if you set it to required. So using recommended gives a little more flexibility to maybe not be kind of stuck. All right, this next one is the rule called consistent entries across SE or rating timing. And this video probably started pretty quick. We'll catch it on the way around. The idea here in the assessment editor is to both autofill information and making sure that a piece of information is consistent. So we have a set of assessments that are all part of kind of one action, whether it's an SE or you have the same rating timing. So here I've got A5 for all 4 of these assessments. They're really all related. Now, if I fill in the rating date, then there will be, I guess this doesn't show my auto-filling. It would fill in everything automatically kind of that first time you do it. So I filled in a date for this first assessment, and I have the consistent entries for the rating date filled in. And so it's going to then make sure all 4 columns, it's going to make sure all 4 columns have the same value for whichever row that I have identified in the rule. So I've used rating timing as a way to communicate that these assessments are all related. The same option works with an SE. There's a consistent entries across SE that does really the same thing, and it's across the SE name field is what it looks at. So it will autofill the 4 of them. Normally there wouldn't be a pop-up that very first time. It autofills all 4 columns as soon as you enter one. And then the nice thing is, if someone were to come back and adjust the rating date, which is kind of this logic here, is if you change something, you'll see that pop up to say, there's a rule that says these need to be consistent across all of them that have the same rating timing. So this A5. So if you make a change to the rating date, then all 4 of those columns, the date will need to change. And there's really no way to break that logic because of this rule. So it's going to have to update all 4 of them, or don't update anything if you were to click cancel. So it can be a time saver with that kind of initial action of just autofilling all of them. But then it's also really that consistency to make sure Something like rating date is obvious, maybe also your crop stage. If it's the same as, you know, the all of the assessment columns were all performed at the exact same time, you know, you can imagine some of the different pieces of information in the header that you maybe want to make sure they're all consistent, because logically they have to be. That's the advantage of this consistent entries across rating timing or SE name. It depends on if you're using SEs, that SE name is probably the one to use, but this rating timing is also a field that's viable for you if you're not using SEs, but you kind of group your assessments by the rating timing instead. Number 2 is strict validation. So you can specify for a particular field in ARM, putting on a strict validation rule requires then that the user utilizes the validation list to fill in that field. So it prevents free typing in that field. The list just comes up automatically. So you'll see here in the rating unit, I type on my keyboard, nothing gets filled in the box. Instead, ARM automatically shows your favorites list or the master list if you haven't used the favorites list, to make the user fill in something from the list. So this is a great way to standardize entries to make sure that someone doesn't hand type information in a field that you really wouldn't want to be hand typed. So, you know, it gives a little flexibility as to the fact they can still fill in whatever they want, but it has to be from the list. So my example, I use the assessment editor, which maybe doesn't make tons of sense if, you know, we have SEs, maybe be a better way to make sure that things are described the way that we want them to be. But it's also available in other fields throughout ARM as well. Obviously, kind of the consideration before you add that is to make sure that the list in ARM that we have is going to be expansive enough to cover your different scenarios. And I think that goes into some of our calculations on which fields actually have strict validation to them as well. So we're trying not to just blindly make every rule or every field able to have strict validation and then have people regret turning that on, but we try to be thoughtful as to which fields would it even make sense to have that available to them. But that comes in as an actual type of study rule. So not required or recommended, it just is the strict validation. Make sure that the validation list is used, the master list is used, and not just hand typed. All right, so on to the number 1 rule in our list, limit validation list. That's kind of the name of the rule when you put the type into the editor, but we do have with our new interface a little bit longer, a little bit better phrasing, I think, for how to turn that on. It's in the assessment data section of your study rules, and it's limiting the assessment crop and pest list to items selected on site description. And this is just one you just turn on or off, and really it is a basically a feature of ARM that you can turn on for a specific trial, or if you put it in your protocol, it would be for all the trials that get created from the protocol. And so the idea here is to create a concrete connection between your assessment crop and pest sections and what you have described in the site description. So the example here showing the pest when I am in an assessment column and I want to add a pest code to describe what pest am I working with, what pest am I assessing, I don't have the full list of all of the weeds, the whole EPO list of weeds. Instead, on the assessment editor, I only see the pests that have been added to the site description, pest description tab. So this makes sure that I don't either type in the wrong pest code, where I just grabbed the wrong one accidentally, or if there is another weed that maybe we didn't anticipate from the get-go, make sure that I don't just put it in the assessment editor and forget to go back to the pest description and add it there as well. So you can see I've got this pest ID code that is now there as well. That matches the 1, 2, 3 different pests that are in this trial on the pest editor. And if, like I said, if I don't see one here that I need to use, there's a new button that literally just takes me to the pest description and adds a new repeating section. So that way I can fill in all the details that are required of me to document the information I need about that pest. So it's not locking people from adding more pests or more crops for that matter, but it's all about keeping things consistent and keeping a very strong link so that everything on the assessment editor from a pest and crop standpoint, everything in the assessment editor matches one that has been defined and described completely in the site description. So we've really think this is super powerful. We've considered just making it the default behavior in ARM because it's that powerful, but we just haven't quite went that far. It still lives here as a study rule that you can turn on, but it comes very highly recommended on our part as just kind of a logical linking, just like we have application codes that have to be referenced in the treatment editor, otherwise we get a message. And those really important references in different sections, you want to make sure they match up. This is just another example that really I can't think of too many downsides where this could really cause a headache, because you really want everything described in that pest description, or like it said, or crop description, but a lot less likely that you need a bunch of different crops. Okay, so that was our top 5. Covered quite a few different rules there, but we do have a few other ones that I think are worth noting here as we dive deeper. So I've got a trial here open for us. I'm just going to scroll down to jump into the study rules editor. And then maybe just to save space, I'm going to unpin that navigation bar so we have a little more room to look at what we see here. couple more rules. We have talked about a couple of these, the consistent entries across the SE. I guess earlier I said it was the SE name. I forgot it's actually the SE group number. So maybe let's spend just a second on that to clarify. So this was the example where we would have the rating date kind of autofill based on your SE. So if I hop over to the assessment data editor, and I'm going to turn on all fields, because this one's usually hidden by default. So in our standard evaluation group here, there's the SE name and SE description, which I assume one of these columns, maybe I haven't loaded an SE. There we go. So I have an SE file that I had loaded called funge18, and that created 2 columns for me. So the name of the file is SE name, and then there's a description that you can put in to describe that SE. There's also a typically hidden field called SE group number, and that just is the way ARM keeps track of multi-column SEs. So, in the event that in my SE, I maybe wanted the name to be different in the different columns that I created, it's certainly possible to set that up in an SE, and totally fine. It won't break this rule because ARM actually has this kind of internal number to keep track of the fact that both 14 and 15 came in together. They are inherently linked because they came in with the same SE. And therefore, if I fill in the rating date for column 14, you'll see how column 15 got automatically filled because I have that consistent entries study rule on for these columns. So just a little clarification here on that rule. We talked about strict validation, the other consistent entries, just using the rating timing. I think the one I really would want to show is this hidden fields, kind of an honorable mention in our top 5, because I think that can have some pretty good uses for it as well. So the rule type, I don't know if that blue makes it hard to read. Let me click in just to an empty cell. The rule type here is hidden field. So it's the ability to mark a particular entry field to be hidden so others cannot see its contents. So probably the most common example for this would be in your treatments list. If I am a sponsor that's going to send out a study for a variety of trialists, and I have some information that is confidential. I don't want everyone to know the ingredients, or maybe there's a particular name of the product that's internal and secret, and we just want to use a kind of a dummy fictitious name for the different products to keep the secrecy. Any of those types of examples, it really would be most helpful for my company to still record that information that we have in the file. So that way we don't have to update the trial later on and put all this information back into the study. That's kind of just a recipe for confusion and mistakes to happen. Instead, I'd like to put it in and then just hide that information. So that way external cooperators can't see those details. So in my case, and usually kind of the recommended route is to hide, to maybe put that information in the description column, perhaps. It's a nice general field. It's got quite a few characters long, so you can put a decent amount of information in there, but it's not super critical for the trialist to be utilizing. So you can put the confidential information to something like the description and then create a hidden field rule for that description. And what happens then if I go up to the description, or excuse me, up to the treatments editor, there is no description column at all. And if I wanted to display all fields to try to find that information, it's just not there. And I'm pretty sure it's typically in this general area here. Isn't available on the editor. No matter where you go in ARM, it's not even in this list of treatment fields. It's as if the treatment description doesn't even exist anymore. There is no way for the trialist to unlock, uncover, find that information. can't print a report to try to get that information on there, nothing. ARM will completely eliminate it from the user, so they cannot access those details. Now, the key to make this work, of course, and kind of the confusing part when you first maybe define a hidden rule, is that when you mark it as hidden, it's actually going to not do anything for you on your screen. Because really the way this rule works is it's hiding that information, but you need to define hiding it from whom. And that is in the condition. So in this case, the hidden field, we're hiding the description column for anyone that's not in my company. So this condition defines who is not going to be able to see this description information. And so that kind of ties into a slightly more advanced function of kind of the way study rules work. But every study rule, when it's created, is given an owner. So if I create a rule, I become the owner of that rule. And here ARM puts in the license, we call it the GDM ID code. So it's just kind of a unique identifier for an ARM licensee. And that is the owner of this rule. So I've got slides here. Let's go back to that presentation. Oh, let me get some text here. So the concept of ownership with study rules, whomever creates the rule, or if they load in a rule set that adds rules to a file, that person is the owner of that rule. You can look up to see what that owner ID, what is that, who is that? You can see yours under help and about ARM. That'll show your license information. And one of those components is that GDM ID code. Again, it's just meant as a unique identifier. So if you were to change your name or whatever, you still have this unique identifier as a person that has a license. So that person's the owner of the ID and owner of the rule, and that ID is then used by ARM to decide, in our case with the hidden rule, it's used to decide who is allowed to see this information. So in this trial here, this GYELMA is a different license. Someone else created the rule, and the license I'm currently using, if I go to my help about ARM, I can see that I've got this testing license here. It's a fictitious person, but I am not in the same company as the person who created this rule. And therefore, I am not able to see that description information. So this owner ID really kicks in for hidden fields, but it does also have has a play for the permissions to edit a rule. So as we mentioned before, if you have some problem with a study rule, you're requiring some information that actually can't be filled in, or you've locked something down that the trialist does need to get to, depending on how you've created, what you've defined in the permissions, the trialist might not be able to change the rule, which typically is probably the desired outcome, is you would not want just anyone to just delete your rules so that they don't have to fulfill them. So kind of the recommended permission is everyone in my company. So once again, person who added the rule, now ARM knows who you are and also your company. So any other licenses that are in your company have the permission to change the rule. And you can see in my example, everything is grayed out on the screen here because me, this license, that first mname license that I'm using, is not part of the company that created these rules. And specifically, in the most common case, if I go under tools about study, there is a trial level ownership as well. And probably fairly common that these would match, but they don't have to. In my examples, it never is. It's never that simple because I'm always using tutorial files and they're a total mess. But in a typical scenario where your protocol writer set up the study, and then the protocol writer maybe sends the protocol to individual trialists that are going to perform the study. You would then have the protocol owner, and that would be in the parentheses there. They maintain some rights and permissions as the license that started the whole thing. So they kind of have the highest level overreach of all, since they're kind of the owner of the study, created this from scratch there. So they have kind of overall ownership there. Then there's the trial owner. So if it is a separate license that actually generated this trial, now you kind of have two licenses that have ownership. Different things that you can do if you get into the GEP or GLP, and there's different levels of the GEP of who's allowed to change what. This ownership becomes even more important. But in general, it's just something that kind of hangs out in the background in most cases. But the most common case, and again, my example doesn't have it, but the most common case is most likely your protocol owner, the person that created this protocol in the first place, is probably the one that added the study rules. And so there'll be a lot of synergy there of that same kind of level of ownership. And everything would tie back then to, if you're in my company, then you could edit and adjust these rules as needed. Just to show the drop down here, let me just I'll create a new site description rule. Doesn't matter a whole lot what it is. Let's make it required to fill in a discipline or something, just to show the drop down for the permissions. So you can set it so that the protocol owner can edit, or just people in my company, or anyone. And I think the safest option is everyone in my company. The advantage here is, again, if the trial list is the trial is being performed and there's some issue with the rules that are implemented, and the trialist says, I can't do my work, or I can't fill this in, there's a problem. If I have set this to all protocol owners, then there might only be one individual that can change the rule. And just like the question about what happens if the protocol owner leaves the company, if I'm the only person that's allowed to change these rules, and then something changes, I may be put on other projects, or I leave the company, whatever, suddenly you're kind of stuck, because only that individual, that one owner ID, that's the only person that can adjust this rule. So then kind of have a mess. So it's much better, both for my sanity. So if I'm the one creating this, do I want to be the only person in my entire company that can change this information? Or would I rather have flexibility that, well, maybe a colleague who's working with a particular individual, they can adjust this too? That adds a lot more flexibility, but still not just allowing anyone. Of course, anyone means that, well, if the trialist doesn't want to follow this rule, they could just delete it. And that maybe defeats some of the purpose as well. So everyone in my company is kind of the right balance. And again, kind of covers that scenario if we are changing licenses, if I move on from this company and suddenly are stranding these rules, that just kind of makes a mess compared to everyone in my company now. Anyone else or whoever gets reassigned my license in this company, they can still adjust the rules if there's an issue. The other advantage, and we had that reference to the protocol owners, a good comment here is to go to your protocol owners. That's in your settings. So I can define additional protocol owners too. So if I'm not the only one that's really working on this project, I could put in another protocol owner. And it's locked right now because the license I'm using is not a protocol owner. So I'm not allowed to add a protocol owner, but if I am the owner of the protocol, I can then define additional protocol owners, additional, I would be typing in a GDM ID, so I can designate that there are others who have the same rights and abilities that I do as the protocol owner. And that's something done in the general tab of the trial settings. So that's really on the trial level itself, being able to have other trial owners, protocol owners, which then can filter into what you can do with rules. So great questions. Really impactful things, kind of behind the scenes that don't always crop up, but when they do, can be kind of a headache. If you do run into any of these situations that we've described where you're kind of stuck, oh, well, we didn't know about this trick, so we've got a bunch of all protocol owner. If you have some situation like that, just send us an email. So we've got some capabilities to go in at like a master level on the ARM side to try to resolve an issue like that if you're really locked down. But like I said, the best thing to do is just get in the habit of using that permissions. It'll default the next rule I create will use that same permissions that I set here. So really just remember to do that once, everyone in my company, and then you really don't have to think about it again. So looping back around just to tie this whole thing together on the hidden fields. Since I am not in the company of this owner ID, so because I am not in the group of people that the person who created the hidden rule specified, I am not allowed to see the description field in the treatments editor. Can't see it. If I were the person defining this rule, I would still be able to see it. So it's a little tricky sometimes to know when I create a hidden field study rule, nothing happens. How do I know it's actually going to work? So kind of why we spent so much time on this permissions and understanding how that works, because it is a little bit tricky when you're the one creating something to hide. It doesn't change what you actually see because you have the permissions, you have the ability to still see that information. But hopefully this kind of demonstrates what it would look like for your cooperators. They cannot see, or whoever you wanted to hide it from, that's what's going to happen. They just won't see it. All right, few minutes left. I'll just try to cover real quick a couple of other rules that are available depending on the scenario. You may have a desire to collect assessment images, and there is a study rule that you can request or require that images be attached. So this one here we're defining, it's in the assessment data section, and it's just generically called image attachments is the field. And you can define in the condition how many images. So do I need an image for every single plot in this assessment? Or I need at least one picture for each treatment. So maybe the standard is in the first replicate to go through and take a picture of each treatment in the first replicate, but you don't need to repeat that for all the other replicates. Just one picture will do for each one, or at least one plot. You can't specify like a specific plot number, but it just says somewhere in this column, at least one picture has to be put in this column. And then you would specify specifically which column you're referring to. So that's a way to communicate. In my case, I set it to be recommended, so I can just communicate, hey, it'd be nice if you would attach pictures, but you can, of course, require it as well. And that just decides, is the trial valid or not, whether you've performed this action. Finally, there's kind of one more category of rules that I want to show. It's all kind of tied to reviewing particular aspects of the study. So the first one here under the site description, you can require a confirmation of the GPS coordinates. So if I turn that on, again here, it's up at the top. So it's really just a on or off function, not a lot of options within there. Just going to require that it'll bring up the little GPS coordinates review dialog. It'll just put whatever coordinates are entered in the study onto like a Bing map, or kind of like Google Maps, but we used Microsoft's Bing. And it'll draw, if you have all four corners, it'll draw all four corners, or it'll just have the lower left. But it'll just put it on a satellite map. So you can make sure, as just a real quick check, that, yeah, those are the right coordinates. I didn't type something wrong. I didn't forget the negative sign, and there the trial's sitting in the middle of the ocean, things like that. And I can specify who should be the individual that needs to perform that. And it'll pop up when they open the study. Also, it would happen during validation if they canceled and didn't insist on it. A quick question here on the image attachments rule here. If just a few pictures are selected and the data is collected with ARM Mobile, so ARM Mobile has the ability to take pictures of the plots. However, we don't have, like, the study rule here won't make its way into ARM Mobile. So you would have to be just a little aware that that was asked of you. But it is certainly possible, if you're aware of the fact that you're supposed to take assessment images for a particular assessment, ARM Mobile is great for taking pictures as you record the data. And then ARM Mobile will send those pictures back into ARM and attach the pictures, thus satisfying this rule. So that is a workflow that ARM Mobile can use to take those pictures. Like I said, the one little caveat, we don't have a validation within the mobile app. So that you would see that images are required. Hopefully I answered that for you. So ARM Mobile will work. But yeah, just be aware that it won't notify you of that requirement. All right, almost out of time, but just a couple more of these reviewing an aspect of a trial that you can turn on. The rest are found in this trial tab of our study rules. We can do a trial review. So on the settings dialog, Windows Settings General tab, there's a box where someone can mark the trial as signed. You can add a signature, or I can simply mark it that I reviewed the trial. So this study rule here, trial must be reviewed for validation, matches this reviewed trial box. So it's basically a way to require that somebody mark this as reviewed, that they have reviewed and looked over the study, and will put a stamp that they have done so. So turning that on, then you'll see that you can specify who needs to review that study, who needs to go in and mark that review, and then the typical permissions. There's also that trial status, there's the signature as well. So we can require a signature, just like we can require that reviewed check mark. You could require a signature be added, and you can choose, in this case, it's related to your trial status, to require somebody fills in that signature for a study. Then last but not least, there's also a reviewing of the study rules. So this one's actually kind of more at the beginning of a study. If I'm the protocol writer and I have a bunch of study rules and I want to basically certify that the trialist will, or I kind of want to have the trialist certify that they have looked at my list of rules. So they can't come back at the end of the season and say, oh, I didn't know you had that rule on there. Instead, we're going to upfront make them confirm that the very first time they open the trial, that they confirm, I looked at the list of rules and I'm confirming that I will follow them. So this is requiring that the study rules are reviewed and accepted. And you can say who you want to review by. So probably, if not in my company, so I send that on to the trialist. If it's an external, but if it's all internal, then I'd set it to, if not me, the person who is going to perform the trial. When they first open it, there will be a prompt and it will show this list of study rules, and they'll have an option to confirm or cancel. And if they cancel, it's read only until they actually confirm it. Okay, so we kind of ran over our time. Not surprising, as I admitted at the beginning, but I appreciate the questions throughout the session. If you have others, or if you're having any troubles within your trial or protocol to get some of these study rules to work, feel free to let us know, and we can help and support you in that. With that, hopefully we'll be seeing you again at a future webinar. Thanks for your participation.